London, 1952. A city that had survived the Blitz. But could it survive beauty? There are flowers that comfort, flowers that celebrate. And then there are flowers that arrive like a warning. This is the story of one such flower. A black orchid, rare, flawless, and delivered to the wrong person, or perhaps exactly the right one. By morning, someone was poisoned. By afternoon, Hercule Poirot was involved. And by evening, nothing in Belgravia's most elegant drawing room would ever be the same again. Jealousy, they say, is an ugly thing. But in this story, it wore silk gloves. It arranged itself in a crystal vase. It smelled of something rare and expensive. And it killed. Stay with us. A most peculiar morning. The morning of the 14th of October began, for Hercule Poirot, in a manner most satisfactory. His breakfast was precisely as it should be. 2 perfectly boiled eggs, their tops removed with surgical neatness. A rack of thin toast and his tisane, steaming gently in the pale autumn light that filtered through the windows of his Whitehaven mansion's flat. He had arranged his napkin with care, aligned his cutlery to an exactness that would have impressed a Swiss watchmaker, and was preparing to address himself to the first egg when the telephone rang. Poirot regarded the instrument with mild displeasure. It was, he felt, a considerable impertinence. The telephone. It had no respect whatsoever for the civilized rituals of the morning. He allowed it to ring 3 times, then, with a small sigh that expressed a great deal, he rose, dabbed his moustaches with the corner of his napkin, and answered it. "Allô? Monsieur Poirot?" The voice on the other end was female, well-bred, English, and carrying beneath its composure a tremor that Poirot's ear detected immediately. "I am sorry to disturb you at this hour. My name is Mrs. Dorothea Ashworth. I was given your name by, well, that is rather beside the point at the moment. The point is, something has happened, something very wrong. I don't quite know how to explain it." "Then, madame," said Poirot pleasantly, "perhaps you will try. From the beginning, if you please." And slowly. There was a brief pause. He could hear her steadying herself. "Last evening," she began, "a flower was delivered to my employer's house, a black orchid, and there was no card, only a small note tucked beneath it. The note said," she stopped. "Yes, madame. It said, 'One of you will not see another morning.'" Poirot was quiet for a moment. He picked up his pen from the writing table beside him, a habit he had when thinking, and turned it slowly between his fingers. "And your employer," he said carefully. "Who is this person?" "Lady Evelyn Marsh," said Mrs. Ashworth. She's one of the most admired women in Belgravia. A widow, enormously wealthy. She collects rare orchids, has done for 30 years. The black orchid, when it arrived, she was delighted. She assumed it was a gift from an admirer. She laughed at the note. She said it was someone's idea of a dramatic joke. But you did not think so. "No," said Mrs. Ashworth quietly. "No, I did not. And this morning," Poirot prompted. Another pause, longer this time. "This morning," said Mrs. Ashworth, "Lady Evelyn did not come down to breakfast, which is entirely unlike her. She's always down by 8:30, always. When I went up to her room at 9:15, I found her. The voice wavered. She was in her bed. She was breathing, but she would not wake. The doctor has been. He says she has been poisoned. He does not yet know how, or by what. He has called the police, but I wanted someone else, someone who would actually understand." Poirot set down his pen. His eggs, he reflected, would be quite cold by now. It was a pity, and yet There was something about this particular telephone call that had caused the little grey cells to stir in a manner they had not stirred in some weeks. There was a quality to it, an elegance almost, a black orchid, a death threat delivered in the manner of a calling card. A woman poisoned in her own bed in one of London's most respectable addresses. It was, Poirot thought, extremely interesting. "You are at Eaton Square?" he asked. "Yes, number 43. I will be there," said Poirot, "within the hour." He replaced the receiver, stood for a moment in thought, then returned to the breakfast table. He sat down, considered his cold eggs with an expression of genuine regret, and ate them anyway. Hastiness, he had long believed, was the enemy of clear thinking. Whatever awaited him at Eaton Square had already happened. Another 20 minutes would alter nothing, except perhaps his digestion. He arrived at number 43 Eaton Square at 23 minutes past 10, a fact he noted with approval, as he had estimated 25. The house was precisely what he had expected. A tall, cream-stuccoed Georgian terrace, immaculately maintained, with a glossy black door and a pair of bay trees in iron planters standing sentinel on either side of the entrance steps. Belgravia, at its most composed, its most certain of itself. And yet, this morning, there was something fractured about that certainty. A police constable stood at the door. A black motor car, not a police vehicle, was parked at the curb, which told Poirot that the doctor was still within. A curtain moved in the first-floor window as he mounted the steps. Someone was watching. He rang the bell. The door was opened almost immediately by a woman of perhaps 50, thin, precise in her movements, dressed in grey. Her face was one of those English faces that had learned, over many years, to reveal very little. But her eyes, Poirot noticed, were red at the rims. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I am Mrs. Ashworth. Thank you for coming so quickly." "It is I who thank you for calling me, madame." He stepped inside, removing his hat and handing it to her with a small bow. "Now, you will take me first, if you please, not to Lady Evelyn, but to the orchid." Mrs. Ashworth blinked. "The orchid?" "Yes." Poirot's eyes moved around the entrance hall. High ceilings, pale walls, the smell of cut flowers and beeswax and something else, faintly chemical, that did not belong. "The orchid," he repeated quietly. "Let us begin at the beginning." She led him to the morning room, a room of considerable beauty, south-facing, its tall windows overlooking the private garden of the square. The room was arranged with the kind of taste that comes not from effort, but from long habit. Good furniture, not ostentatious. Watercolours on the walls, pleasingly subdued. And there, on a low table beside the fireplace, standing in a tall crystal vase, the orchid. Poirot stopped. He stood very still for a moment, his head tilted slightly to one side, regarding it. It was objectively a remarkable thing. The bloom was large, larger than most orchids he had seen, and its colour was extraordinary. Not merely dark purple, as some so-called black orchids proved to be on closer inspection, but a true, dense, velvety black, with the faintest trace of deepest crimson at the very heart of the flower. The petals were perfect, unblemished. It stood in its crystal vase with an air of absolute composure, as though entirely aware of its own exceptional nature. And on the table beside the vase, smoothed flat, was a small piece of white card. Poirot leaned forward. He did not touch it. The writing was neat, unhurried, done with a good pen. "One of you will not see another morning." He straightened up. His expression gave nothing away, but behind his eyes the grey cells had begun their quiet, methodical work. "Who else," he said, "was in this house last evening?" Mrs. Ashworth folded her hands. "There was a dinner," she said. "Lady Evelyn entertained 4 guests. They came at 8 and left, the last of them, just before midnight. Their names, if you please. Mr. Gerald Finch Hayes. He was a very old friend of Lady Evelyn's late husband. He comes often. He is perhaps 60, rather distinguished, something in finance." She paused. Then there was Miss Cecily Rowe. She is young, perhaps 28. She studies botany at London University. Lady Evelyn took an interest in her on account of the orchids. She's been here perhaps half a dozen times. And the others? Colonel Arthur Bramwell. He is a neighbour, lives 2 doors along, a widower, very correct, very military. He and Lady Evelyn have known each other for years. She hesitated very slightly before the next name. And Mrs. Iris Fane. "You hesitate, madame." Mrs. Ashworth's expression remained neutral. "Mrs. Fane she is rather a recent acquaintance of Lady Evelyn's. She arrived in London from Cape Town approximately 8 months ago. She has become very, very attentive to Lady Evelyn, very present." "I see," said Poirot. He did not comment further on that. "And the orchid, at what point during the evening did it arrive?" "During dinner. It was brought to the door by a delivery boy, quite young, perhaps 15 or 16. He said only that he had been paid to bring it. No shop, no florist's paper, just the orchid in a plain box and the card beneath it. Lady Evelyn opened it herself. Yes, she brought it to the table. She was quite thrilled by it, Monsieur Poirot. She knew immediately what it was. She said she had been searching for a specimen of that particular variety for nearly 3 years." Poirot turned back to look at the orchid once more. Jealousy, he thought, and obsession. And whoever sent this knew exactly which weapon to choose. "Very well," he said quietly. "Now, take me to Lady Evelyn." The house on Eaton Square. Lady Evelyn Marsh's bedroom was on the 1st floor, a large, quietly magnificent room that faced the rear garden. The curtains had been drawn back, and the pale October light fell across a 4-poster bed, its canopy of faded ivory silk, its posts dark mahogany, worn smooth by decades of careful polishing. In the bed lay a woman. Poirot stood in the doorway for a moment before entering. He had learned over many years that a room tells you a great deal before you have spoken to a single person within it. You had only to look, to be still, and to look. Lady Evelyn Marsh was, he estimated, somewhere between 60 and 65. Even in her present state, there was about her an unmistakable quality. The bone structure was fine. The silver hair, though disordered now against the pillow, it had been carefully arranged the night before. The hands that lay above the coverlet were thin, well-shaped, the nails neatly kept. On the 3rd finger of the right hand, a ring, a single large emerald, very fine. She was breathing. That was the essential thing. Beside the bed stood Dr. Calthrop, compact, efficient-looking, with the slightly weary expression of a man called out before he had finished his breakfast. He looked up as Poirot entered. "Who are you?" "My name is Poirot, Hercule Poirot. I have been asked by the household to assist." He moved to the bedside and looked down at Lady Evelyn with careful attention. "Your initial assessment, Doctor?" Calthrop considered him briefly. Weighing, Poirot suspected whether he was worth answering, then something that acts on the central nervous system. If the presentation is consistent with several compounds, some synthetic, some botanical. Given the circumstances of the household, a botanical source seems worth investigating. "The orchids," said Poirot. "Quite. She will recover?" "If we identify the compound in time, yes, I believe so. She is strong, but time is not entirely on our side." "Then we will not waste it," said Poirot. He made a brief, careful examination of the room, not touching anything, simply observing. The bedside table held a glass of water, half empty, and a small bottle of sleeping tablets. A book lay face down beside the lamp, a volume on orchid cultivation. On the dressing table, a silver tray of perfume bottles stood in precise alignment, and beside them, a small dish containing a pair of earrings, removed before retiring. Everything was as it should be, and yet something was not right. Poirot stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, his eyes moving from surface to surface. Something was absent, something that should have been there and was not. He could not, for the moment, identify it. He filed the feeling carefully away. "The water glass," he said to Mrs. Ashworth. "Has anyone touched it this morning?" "No. The police constable said nothing in the room was to be disturbed." "Good." He looked at it without touching it. Water could be many things and still appear quite clear. "We will leave it for the police analyst." He turned to Mrs. Ashworth. "Who came upstairs last evening?" "Mrs. Fane asked to use the bathroom on this floor at perhaps 10:30. She was gone perhaps 5 minutes. And Lady Evelyn, when did she retire? Shortly before 11, and she said good night to the guests in the drawing room and came up a few minutes later. I brought her warm milk at 11, as I do every evening. She seemed perfectly well. Happy even. She was talking about the orchid." "The warm milk," said Poirot. "You prepared it yourself?" "As always, in the kitchen, and brought it directly to her." Poirot looked at the glass of water on the bedside table, then at the sleeping tablets. He said nothing. But the grey cells had noted something, a small, quiet something, and set it aside for later. Downstairs in the morning room, 2 people had arrived during Poirot's examination of the bedroom. The first was Inspector Welch, tall, angular, regarding Poirot with the expression English policemen reserved for him. Reluctant respect mixed with mild personal irritation. "Monsieur Poirot, I'm aware of your reputation, but I must ask you to keep out of your way," said Poirot pleasantly. "But of course, I will only observe. You will hardly know I am present." Welch looked as though he doubted this considerably. The second arrival was Gerald Finch Hayes, seated near the window, turning his hat in his hands with the slow rhythm of controlled anxiety. He rose when Poirot entered. "Gerald Finch Hayes. I came as soon as Mrs. Ashworth telephoned. How is she?" "Stable," said Poirot carefully. "The doctor is attending to her. You are a close friend." "For nearly 30 years." He said it simply, but there was weight to it. A weight Poirot noted. "Since before her husband died. After Charles passed 8 years ago, I have tried to look in on Evelyn when I can." "You were present when the orchid arrived?" Finch Hayes's expression shifted. Something moved behind his eyes briefly. "Yes, during the first course. Evelyn was extraordinarily pleased. She set it there." He nodded toward the crystal vase in the morning room. "She read the note and laughed, said someone was being theatrical." "And what did you think?" A pause. "I thought," said Finch Hayes slowly, "that someone in that room knew exactly what they were doing." Poirot stood for a long moment after Finch Hayes had said this, looking again at the Black Orchid. In its crystal vase, in the pale morning light, it was, he had to admit it, a thing of remarkable, almost disturbing beauty. Its absolute blackness was not merely dark, but somehow complete, final. As though it had absorbed all color and given nothing back. Jealousy, he thought, and obsession. And obsession, in Poirot's experience, was always the more dangerous of the two. He turned from the orchid. There was work to be done. The circle of suspects. Inspector Welch, to his credit, had been efficient. By 11:30, he had arranged for all 4 of the previous evening's dinner guests to return to number 43 Eaton Square. They had come, some willingly, some with the carefully concealed reluctance of people who had other places to be, and did not wish to explain why. They sat now in the drawing room on the first floor, a long, beautifully proportioned room of pale green walls and tall windows, arranged in the loose, slightly awkward manner of people who know each other but are not, this morning, entirely comfortable in each other's company. Poirot sat to one side, near the fireplace, in a small gilded chair that he had quietly appropriated because it afforded him the best view of the room. He held a small notebook, but though he wrote very little in it, his eyes did the real work. Inspector Welch stood near the door. Mrs. Ashworth had withdrawn to the kitchen. The 5 of them, 4 suspects and 1 policeman, occupied the drawing room with the particular tension of people waiting for something unpleasant to begin. Poirot looked at each of them in turn. Gerald Finch Hayes he had already met. The man sat in the chair nearest the window, one leg crossed over the other, his recovered composure very nearly convincing, very nearly. The hat which he had been turning in his hands downstairs now sat on the table beside him, but his right thumb moved in a slow, repetitive arc across the arm of the chair. A small thing, but small things in Poirot's experience were rarely small. Beside Finch Hayes, at a slight but perceptible distance, sat Miss Cecily Rowe. She was younger than Poirot had imagined from Mrs. Ashworth's description, or perhaps it was simply that she looked younger than 28. She was slight, with dark hair cut rather severely, and the kind of pale, clear skin that comes from spending more time indoors than out. She wore a plain navy dress, and no jewellery except a small brooch at her collar, a silver orchid Poirot noted with interest. She sat very straight, her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes, large, dark, and considerably more intelligent than her composed expression suggested, moved around the room with a careful, methodical attention that reminded Poirot, not unpleasantly, of himself. She was watching everyone, and trying not to be seen doing it. Across the room, occupying the small sofa near the fireplace with the ease of a man who is comfortable in any chair he chooses to sit in, was Colonel Arthur Bramwell. He was perhaps 62 or 63, broad-shouldered, straight-backed, with a clipped grey moustache and the permanently weathered complexion of a man who had spent years in climates considerably less temperate than England. He had the soldier's habit of stillness, the ability to wait without fidgeting, without speaking, without revealing anything at all. But his eyes, when they moved quickly. He had said nothing since Poirot entered the room. He had simply looked at Poirot with a brief, assessing glance, the kind of glance that takes a full measure in an instant, and then returned to his contemplation of the middle distance. And finally, at the far end of the room, seated apart from the others in a manner that managed to seem both deliberate and entirely natural, was Mrs. Iris Fane. Poirot studied her with particular attention. She was, he estimated, perhaps 45, though she might have been younger and merely looked older, or older and looked younger. The kind of ambiguity that certain women cultivate with great care. She was striking rather than beautiful. A strong face, very defined features, skin with the warmth of someone who had spent years in a sunnier country. Her clothes were expensive. A deep burgundy dress, well cut, with a single strand of pearls. Her dark hair was arranged with precision. Everything about her was arranged with precision. But it was her stillness that interested Poirot most. The others, in their various ways, were managing their discomfort, suppressing it, controlling it, working around it. Mrs. Fane appeared to have no discomfort to manage. She sat with her hands in her lap and an expression of polite concern on her face, and she looked for all the world like a woman who had come to offer sympathy and had no other reason to be present. It was, Poirot thought, an exceptionally accomplished performance, or it was entirely genuine, and she was innocent. The grey cells reserved judgment. Inspector Welch spoke first, briefly, formally, explaining the situation with the practiced economy of a man who had done this sort of thing many times before. Lady Evelyn had been poisoned. The matter was under investigation. He would require statements from each of them. He thanked them for coming. Then he looked at Poirot. Poirot understood the look. It said, "You may proceed, but do not make me regret this." He rose from his gilded chair, clasped his hands lightly behind his back, and addressed the room. "Mesdames, Messieurs," he said, "I will not detain you long this morning. There will be time, much more time, for the detailed questions. For now, I wish only to understand one thing." He paused, letting the silence settle. "Last evening, you were all present in this house when a most unusual object arrived. A black orchid, and with it, a note." He looked around the room. "I would like each of you to tell me, simply without elaboration, what you thought when you read that note." A small silence. Then Miss Cecily Rose said, in a clear, quiet voice, "I thought it was real." Everyone looked at her. She did not appear discomforted by the attention. "The note, I thought it was a genuine threat, not a joke. The wording was too specific, too considered." She paused. "And the orchid itself, a black orchid of that variety doesn't simply appear. Someone went to considerable trouble to obtain it. That's not the action of someone being playful." "You know orchids, mademoiselle," said Poirot. "I study them." She touched the brooch at her collar briefly, an unconscious gesture. "That specimen, the one downstairs, is a Dracula vampira, extraordinarily rare. I've only seen photographs. To find one, to obtain one, it would require either very significant money or very specific connections, or both." "And you, Monsieur Finch-Hayes?" Poirot turned to him. Finch-Hayes uncrossed his legs and recrossed them in the other direction. "I thought, as Evelyn did initially, that it was someone's idea of theatre. Evelyn has many admirers. Some of them are rather dramatic in their expressions of 'he stopped,' but afterward, when I was in the car going home, I found I was less certain." "Less certain of what, precisely?" "That it was harmless." He said it flatly, without looking at anyone in particular. Poirot turned to Colonel Bramwell. The Colonel met his gaze directly. "Thought it was a threat," he said, "plain and simple. Told Evelyn so at the time. She didn't want to hear it." A pause. "Women of Evelyn's type never do." "Her type?" said Poirot mildly. "Independent, accustomed to being right." Not unkindly, if anything, with a trace of something that might have been admiration. "She's been managing this house and her own affairs for 8 years without assistance. She doesn't much care for the suggestion that she might be in danger." "And yet she was," said Poirot quietly. Bramwell said nothing. Poirot turned, at last, to Mrs. Iris Fane. She met his gaze with a small, composed smile. "I agreed with Lady Evelyn," she said. Her voice was low, with a faint trace, just a trace, of somewhere else beneath the careful English. "South Africa," Mrs. Ashworth had said. "Someone being dramatic. Evelyn receives a great deal of attention. Not all of it is entirely rational. From admirers, you mean? From people who are perhaps too invested in her. She said it delicately, precisely, and with no particular emphasis. And yet the words landed in the room with a weight that was slightly more than their surface suggested. "Too invested," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, well, that is an interesting phrase." Mrs. Fane's smile did not waver. After the initial exchanges, Inspector Welch took each person in turn to a small room off the hallway to give their formal statements. Poirot did not accompany him. He remained at the drawing room, and in the intervals when he was briefly alone, or nearly alone, he observed. He observed that Miss Cecily Rowe, waiting her turn, rose and walked to the window, and stood for several minutes looking down at the street below with an expression that was not quite sorrow and not quite fear, but something that moved between the two. He observed that Colonel Bramwell, also waiting, picked up a small figurine from the mantelpiece, a porcelain dog, examined it, set it back, and then looked at the door through which Mrs. Fane had just passed with an expression he quickly rearranged when he noticed Poirot watching. He observed that Gerald Finch-Hayes, when left alone in the room with Poirot, while Bramwell gave his statement, said nothing for nearly 4 minutes, and then said abruptly, without preamble, "She trusted everyone in that room last night. That is the thing that—" He stopped. "Evelyn is not a foolish woman. She is one of the least foolish women I have ever known. And yet, she trusted all of them. And you, Monsieur Finch-Hayes?" said Poirot carefully. "Did you trust all of them?" A long pause. "No," said Finch-Hayes. "No, I did not. Which of them did you not trust?" But at that moment, Inspector Welch opened the door and asked Finch-Hayes to come through, and the question remained, for now, unanswered. Poirot sat for a moment in the empty drawing room. From where he sat, through the open door of the morning room across the hall, he could see the Black Orchid in its crystal vase. It stood in the pale light, perfect and still, its dark petals entirely unmoved by everything that had occurred around it. He thought about jealousy, about how it begins, always, as something that looks remarkably like love, how it attaches itself to the beloved object and will not let go, and how, when it cannot possess, it destroys. And he thought about obsession, which was perhaps the same thing, only quieter, only more patient. One of you will not see another morning. But which one? And why the orchid? Why this particular flower, sent to this particular woman on this particular evening? He would need to know more about Lady Evelyn, about her late husband, about the 4 people who had sat at her table last night. And he would need, most urgently, to speak to each of them alone. He was still sitting thus, thinking very still, his eyes half closed, when Mrs. Ashworth appeared in the doorway. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "there is something I did not mention earlier. I'm not sure if it is relevant." "In my experience, madame," said Poirot, opening his eyes, "the things people are not sure are relevant are almost always the most relevant of all. Please sit down." She sat, folding her hands with her customary neatness. "Last week," she said, "on Thursday, 3 days before the dinner, Miss Rowe came to the house. She came in the afternoon when Lady Evelyn was out. She said she had left her umbrella behind on a previous visit and wished to collect it." A pause. "I found the umbrella for her, but I happened to pass the morning room while she was in the hallway, and I noticed that she had gone in. She was standing near Lady Evelyn's writing desk. When she heard me, she moved away and said she had simply been admiring the room." Poirot was very still. "The writing desk," he said. "And what is kept in the writing desk?" "Lady Evelyn's private correspondence, mostly, and her address book, and," Mrs. Ashworth paused, "her household diary. in which she keeps the details of her social engagements, including—" She stopped again. "Including," said Poirot quietly, "the dinner party of last Thursday 14th. Yes." He looked at her for a moment. "You did not mention this to Inspector Welch." No, I wasn't certain it meant anything. Miss Rowe seemed perfectly—" "Madame," said Poirot gently, "you will mention it to Inspector Welch. Now, if you please." She rose at once and went. Poirot turned back to the orchid. Dracula Vampira, Miss Rowe had called it, with the ease and familiarity of long knowledge. And she had been in this room, alone, 3 days before the dinner. Near the writing desk, near the diary that contained the details of the evening. He filed it carefully. He did not conclude, not yet. The grey cells required more material before they would permit a conclusion. But it was, he thought, a very interesting beginning. Little grey cells at work. Poirot began his individual interviews that afternoon. He had requested, and Inspector Welch had, with only moderate reluctance, permitted, the use of Lady Evelyn's study on the ground floor. It was a small room, book-lined, with a desk of dark walnut and 2 leather chairs arranged before it. The room smelled of old paper and a faint trace of the same perfume Poirot had noticed upstairs, Lady Evelyn's presumably, absorbed over years into the fabric of the house itself. It was, altogether, a room that suited Poirot's purposes admirably. Enclosed, quiet, no distractions. He interviewed them in the order he had decided upon during his period of reflection in the drawing room, which was not, as it happened, the order Inspector Welch would have chosen. Ian was not the order any of the 4 suspects might have predicted. Poirot had long found that the sequence in which one spoke to people was itself a kind of information. Who was kept waiting, and how they bore the waiting, told you a great deal. He began with Colonel Bramwell. The colonel settled into the leather chair with the ease of a man who had sat in many chairs in many difficult circumstances, and had learned not to be defined by any of them. He looked at Poirot with those quick, assessing eyes and said nothing, waiting. Poirot appreciated that. He had no patience for people who filled silences unnecessarily. "Colonel Bramwell," he began, "you have known Lady Evelyn for many years." 15, said Bramwell, "give or take. And in that time you have observed her, her circle of friends, her habits, her attachments." A very slight pause. "Yes, tell me about Mrs. Fane." Bramwell's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A fractional tightening, quickly released. "What would you like to know?" "Whatever you consider relevant." The colonel looked at the window for a moment. Then, Iris Fane arrived in London in February. Through a mutual acquaintance, a woman named Hartley, I believe, who knows everyone and is close to no one. Mrs. Fane was introduced to Evelyn at some gallery opening. He paused. Within a month she was here twice a week. Within 3 months she had a key to the garden door. Lady Evelyn gave her a key. Evelyn gave it to her, yes? He said it without inflection, but the absence of inflection was itself expressive. Yeah, and this concerned you. It struck me as rapid. Bramwell turned his eyes back to Poirot. Evelyn is a generous woman. She forms attachments quickly. She always has. It is one of her qualities. He said this last with a deliberateness that suggested he had considered and rejected several other words. But Mrs. Fane there is a quality to her attention that I find studied. Studied? Poirot repeated. You mean calculated? I mean it does not feel natural. A pause. But I may be wrong. I am not, he said with a soldier's blunt self-awareness, an especially perceptive man in matters of this kind. Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. He was not certain he agreed with that assessment. "And the orchid, Colonel? When it arrived last evening, you said you told Lady Evelyn immediately that you believed it was a genuine threat." "I did." "What was Mrs. Fane's reaction to your saying so?" Bramwell was quiet for a moment. "She laughed, lightly. She said I was being, what was the phrase, protective to a fault. She said Evelyn had many devoted admirers, and this was simply one of them being poetic. And Lady Evelyn found this persuasive. Evelyn found it reassuring. A slight distinction, and Bramwell made it deliberately. There is a difference. Evelyn wanted to be reassured. Mrs. Fane provided the reassurance." He paused. "It was neatly done." Poirot said nothing for a moment. Then, "One final question, Colonel. You live 2 doors along, you said. Last evening, after you left this house, did you notice anything? Anyone in the street? Perhaps. Any vehicle you did not recognize?" Bramwell considered. "There was a motor car, parked on the opposite side of the square, dark-coloured. I couldn't tell you the make. It was there when I arrived at 8, and still there when I left at 1:45. I didn't think anything of it at the time." "But you noticed it?" "Old habit." He said it simply. A soldier's habit. The habit of a man who had learned, in various unpleasant circumstances, that the things you do not notice are the things that kill you. Poirot thanked him, and he left. Miss Cecily Rowe came next. She sat down with the careful neatness of someone who is very conscious of how they appear, and looked at Poirot with those large, dark, watchful eyes, and waited. "Mademoiselle Rowe," said Poirot pleasantly, "you study botany?" "Yes, at University College. My particular focus is epiphytic orchids, those that grow on other plants rather than in soil." She said this with the slight, unconscious authority of someone discussing their own domain. "I have been working with Lady Evelyn's collection for the past year. She has some extraordinary specimens." "It was through the orchids that you became acquainted with her?" "Yes. I wrote to her, rather boldly I suppose, asking if I might examine certain plants in her collection for my research. She invited me to come." A small pause. She was very kind, very generous with her time and her knowledge. "You admire her?" "Very much," said simply, and Poirot believed it entirely. "And the Black Orchid, mademoiselle, the Dracula vampira. You identified it immediately last evening." "Yes. Had you ever seen one before? In person?" A fractional hesitation. "No, only in photographs and botanical drawings." "And yet you knew it at once." "I know orchids," she said it without apology. "The Dracula vampira is distinctive. There is really nothing else quite like it." Poirot nodded slowly. "Mademoiselle, I must ask you something directly, and I hope you will answer me with equal directness." He paused. "Last Thursday, 3 days before the dinner, you came to this house in Lady Evelyn's absence to collect an umbrella." Something moved in her expression. Very quickly, very briefly. "Yes." "And while you were here, you were in this room, near the writing desk." A silence. "I was looking at the books," she said. "Mademoiselle." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her hands. I wanted to know who else would be at the dinner," she said quietly. "I knew Lady Evelyn kept her diary in the desk. She had shown it to me once, her system for recording her engagements. I looked at it. I know I should not have." "And why did you wish to know who would be present?" A pause, a longer one. "Because of Mrs. Fane," she said finally. Poirot waited. "I don't trust her," said Cecily Rowe, and now her voice had lost its careful composure and become something more direct, more urgent. I have watched her with Lady Evelyn for months. The attention she gives, it doesn't feel like friendship, it feels like ownership, as though Lady Evelyn is something she has acquired and intends to keep." She stopped, drew a breath. "Lady Evelyn is very fond of her. She doesn't see it. And I did not know how to say it without sounding jealous," said Poirot gently. She looked up quickly. "I am not jealous," she said. "I am concerned. There is a difference." Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. He had heard that distinction made twice now in one afternoon. It was interesting how often the two things sat so close together that the person experiencing them genuinely could not tell them apart. "Mademoiselle," he said, "do you know where one might obtain a Dracula Vampira orchid in London?" She blinked at the change of direction. "It would be very difficult. There are perhaps 2 or 3 specialist collectors who might have access, and one importer, a man named Welt, who operates out of a premises in Kensington. He deals in rare botanical specimens. If anyone in London could obtain one, it would be through him." Poirot wrote the name in his notebook. One of the few things he wrote all afternoon. "Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful." She rose to leave. At the door, she paused. "Monsieur Poirot, is she going to be all right? Lady Evelyn?" "I intend," said Poirot, "to do everything in my power to ensure that she is." It was perhaps a slight evasion, but Miss Rowe seemed to find it sufficient, and she went. Gerald Finch Hayes was different from the others in one essential respect. He was afraid. Not in a manner that was visible. He was far too composed for that, too accustomed to the management of his own expressions. But fear, in Poirot's experience, has a particular quality that no amount of composure entirely conceals. It sits behind the eyes. It tightens the jaw by a fraction. It makes a man choose his words with just slightly more care than the situation, on its surface, seems to require. "Monsieur Finch Hayes," said Poirot, "you were about to tell me something this morning. Before Inspector Welch interrupted, you said that you did not trust all of the people at last evening's dinner." Finch Hayes settled his hands on his knees. "Did I say that? You did. And then you were called away before you could tell me which of them you did not trust." A pause. "I am asking you now." A long silence. Finch Hayes looked at the window, then back at Poirot. "I have known Evelyn for 30 years, he said. "I knew her before she married Charles. I knew her through the marriage, and after it, I have." He stopped, rearranged something. I care very deeply about her well-being." Poirot said nothing. "Mrs. Fane," said Finch Hayes, "it is Mrs. Fane I don't trust. Tell me why." "Because I have made inquiries." He said it simply, without embarrassment. After Mrs. Fane first appeared, after it became clear she was becoming significant to Evelyn, I made certain inquiries through a contact in Cape Town about her background, her history. "And what did you find?" Finch Hayes was quiet for a moment. "I found that she had been in Cape Town very closely attached to another wealthy widow, a woman named Mrs. Price. The attachment had lasted approximately 2 years. At the end of those 2 years, Mrs. Price had changed her will, leaving a considerable portion of her estate to a charitable foundation that Mrs. Fane had introduced her to." A pause. 3 months later, Mrs. Price died. A cardiac episode, the doctors said. Poirot was very still. "And the charitable foundation," he said carefully, "dissolved 6 months after Mrs. Price's death. The funds, considerable funds, appear to have been redirected in a manner that my contact was unable to fully trace." He looked at Poirot steadily. I may be drawing connections that do not exist. I am aware of that. I am a cautious man by nature and by profession, but the pattern troubled you, said Poirot. The pattern troubles me enormously. And you said nothing of this to Lady Evelyn? I tried. Once, in June. The fear behind his eyes became for a moment something more specific. Something that looked very like guilt. She did not receive it well. She said I was being possessive. That I had never approved of her friendships. And this was simply another instance of it. He paused. We did not speak for 3 weeks afterward. Poirot looked at him for a long moment. Monsieur Finch Hayes, do you have documentation of any of this? The inquiries you made? Some. Letters from my contact in Cape Town. I can have them sent round. Please do so. Today, if possible. He paused. And monsieur, you will forgive me, but I must ask. Your interest in Lady Evelyn. It is purely that of an old friend. Finch Hayes met his gaze, said nothing for a moment. Then, it began that way, he said quietly, 30 years ago. He left without elaborating, and Poirot did not press him. Mrs. Iris Fane came last. She entered the room with a composure so complete it was almost architectural. Structural, load-bearing, are designed to withstand considerable pressure. She sat down, arranged herself, and looked at Poirot with an expression of cooperative concern that was, he thought, one of the more accomplished things he had seen in a considerable career of observing human beings. Monsieur Poirot, she said, I want to help in any way I can. Madame Fane, said Poirot pleasantly, tell me about Mrs. Price. The composure did not shatter. That would have been too much to hope for, but it shifted, a microscopic recalibration gone almost before it appeared. I beg your pardon, she said, Mrs. Price of Cape Town, with whom I understand you were closely acquainted some years ago? A pause, very controlled. I knew Eleanor Price, yes. She was a dear friend. Her death was a very great loss. And the charitable foundation she supported was the one you introduced her to. The Kestrel Trust. Yes. Evelyn supported several charitable causes. I introduced her to several organizations I believed in. A pause. I understand that after her death, the trust encountered some administrative difficulties. I had no involvement in its management. Of course, said Poirot pleasantly. He looked at her. She looked at him. It was, for a moment, rather like two chess players examining a board. Madame Fane, he said, how did you come to be in London? I had always intended to return to England eventually. My mother was English. I spent part of my childhood here. And the mutual acquaintance, Mrs. Hartley, I believe, who introduced you to Lady Evelyn. You knew her from Cape Town? From various places. One accumulates acquaintances. Indeed. Poirot folded his hands. And Lady Evelyn's orchid collection, you share her enthusiasm for it? I find it fascinating, though I cannot claim Evelyn's depth of knowledge. Or Miss Rose. Something moved across Mrs. Fane's face at the name. It was not anger. It was subtler than anger. Miss Rose is very knowledgeable, she said evenly, and very devoted to Lady Evelyn. As are you, madame. Yes, simply, as am I. Poirot studied her for a long moment. Then he said, almost as an afterthought, almost carelessly, Madame Fane, have you ever visited a botanical importer by the name of Velt, in Kensington? This time the pause was just a fraction longer than it should have been. I don't believe so. The name isn't familiar. No matter, said Poirot lightly. It is not important. He thanked her and she left. He sat for a long moment in the empty study. He had, he reflected, learned a great deal this afternoon. And he now recognized it clearly, one significant error. During the interviews, somewhere between Miss Rowe's careful account and Finch Hayes's troubled confession, he had formed a conclusion. A preliminary conclusion. A working theory, the kind the grey cells sometimes offered before all the evidence was assembled. He had decided, with perhaps more certainty than was warranted, that the matter began and ended with Mrs. Iris Fane. It was a reasonable conclusion. It was well supported. The pattern from Cape Town, the studied attention, the too perfect composure. And yet, Poirot had lived long enough and investigated enough to know that the most reasonable conclusion, arrived at too quickly, was a dangerous thing. It closed doors that should remain open. It caused you to stop seeing what was in front of you. He thought of Miss Rowe, at the writing desk, 3 days before the dinner. Her knowledge of the orchid, her reaction to Mrs. Fane, which she had called concern, and which might have been concern, and might have been something else entirely. He thought of Finch Hayes, 30 years of feeling, and guilt, the guilt of a man who had tried once to warn the woman he loved, and had been rebuffed, and had said nothing more. He thought of Colonel Bramwell, the motor car parked across the square all evening. Old habit, he had said, the habit of noticing. He thought of Mrs. Fane, and the pause, just a fraction too long, at the name Velt. No, he had been too hasty. The grey cells required more. They required, specifically, a visit to a botanical importer in Kensington, and they required the letters from Cape Town that Finch Hayes had promised. And they required, most urgently, the laboratory report that Dr. Calthrop had said would be ready by afternoon. Poirot looked at his watch. It was 3:30. He reached for his hat. The Second Orchid. The laboratory report arrived at 4 o'clock. Dr. Calthrop delivered it in person, which told Poirot something in itself. A man who sends results sends information. A man who delivers them himself has something to say about them that he does not wish to commit to paper. He found Poirot in the morning room, standing once again before the Black Orchid. It had been there all day, untouched, unmoved, entirely composed, and Poirot had found himself returning to it at intervals, the way one returns to a problem that refuses to resolve itself into clarity. Dr. Calthrop closed the door behind him. The compound, he said without preamble, is an alkaloid derivative, specifically a concentrated extract drawn from the root system of a particular species of orchid. He paused. A rare species, not commercially available, not something you would find in any ordinary garden or greenhouse. Poirot turned from the orchid. Which species? Calthrop looked at him steadily. The laboratory has identified it as consistent with compounds found in Dracula genus specimens. The precise species cannot be confirmed without further analysis, but... He stopped. His eyes moved briefly to the Black Orchid in its crystal vase. But the preliminary findings are suggestive. Poirot followed his gaze. They both looked at the orchid for a moment. The orchid itself, said Poirot slowly. The poison was derived from the orchid itself. From a specimen of the same genus. Whether from this particular flower, that we cannot yet say. The root extract would need to have been prepared in advance. It is not something done quickly or casually. It requires knowledge, equipment, time, and the method of administration. The water glass on the bedside table. The analyst found trace residue. Calthrop folded the report and placed it in his jacket pocket. A very small quantity dissolved in the water. Sufficient, given the concentration, to produce the effect we observed. Had Lady Evelyn drunk the entire glass, which she apparently did not, the outcome might have been considerably more serious. Poirot was quiet for a moment. He thought of Lady Evelyn upstairs, the thin hands above the coverlet, the shallow breathing, and felt again that small, genuine anger that had visited him that morning. Controlled, quiet, but present. "She is improving?" he asked. Slowly. She regained partial consciousness at 2:00. She is not yet able to speak coherently, but Dr. Hargreaves from the hospital is with her and is cautiously optimistic. A pause. "She is, as I said, a strong woman." "Good," said Poirot, simply and with feeling. After Calthrop had gone, Poirot stood for a long moment in the morning room. The orchid. The poison had come from the orchid, or from a specimen of its family. And who in that house, who among those 4 people, had the knowledge to prepare such a compound? Who had access to the necessary specimens? Who had the equipment, the expertise, the cold patience required to distill a poison from a living flower? He thought of Miss Cecily Rowe, who studied epiphytic orchids at University College and could identify a Dracula vampira from a photograph. He thought of Mrs. Iris Fane, who had paused just a fraction too long at the name of Velt, the botanical importer in Kensington, and he reached for his coat. The premises of H. Velt and Son, botanical importers, occupied the ground floor of an unremarkable building in a narrow street off Kensington High Street. The window display was sparse. A few specimen jars, a faded botanical print, a hand-lettered card that read rare and exotic species. By appointment. The sort of establishment that does not need to advertise, because the people who need to find it always do. The bell above the door produced a thin, reedy sound as Poirot entered. The man behind the counter was elderly, 70s perhaps, with the fine-boned delicacy of a man who had spent his life handling fragile things. He looked up from a ledger and regarded Poirot over a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles. "Mr. Velt?" said Poirot. "The younger," said the man, but in a tone that suggested this distinction had long ceased to carry any real meaning. "My father passed in 1947. What can I do for you?" Poirot presented himself simply. A private investigator, assisting the police in a matter of some delicacy. He did not mention Lady Evelyn by name. He did not need to. "I am interested," he said, "in a specimen of Dracula vampira. I understand you may be among the very few importers in London who deals in specimens of that rarity." Velt regarded him for a moment. Then he set down his pen. "I had one," he said, "one specimen. It came to me from a grower in Ecuador. Took me the better part of 2 years to arrange. Arrived in August." A pause. "Well, I sold it 3 weeks ago. To whom?" Velt opened his ledger with the deliberate slowness of a man who has decided to be cooperative, but intends to take his time about it. He ran a thin finger down a column of entries. Client name recorded as... He paused. "Rowe, C. Rowe, paid in cash." Poirot stood very still. "Rowe," he repeated. "Yes." Velt looked at him over his spectacles. A young woman. Dark hair. She knew her orchids, that I will say. She asked the right questions. She handled the specimen correctly. He closed the ledger. I assumed she was a collector. Did she say what she intended to do with it? "She said it was a gift," said Velt, "for someone who had long wanted one." Poirot returned to Eaton Square at 5:30. His mind, during the journey, was engaged in a process of considerable revision, but he had been wrong. Not entirely wrong. The grey cells were rarely entirely wrong, but wrong in the particular way that was most dangerous. He had allowed one compelling suspect to occupy the foreground of his attention, and had permitted the others to recede into the background, where they had continued, quietly, to do things he had not sufficiently attended to. Miss Cecily Rowe had purchased the orchid. Miss Cecily Rowe who studied orchids, who knew their properties, who had been 3 days before the dinner at Lady Evelyn's writing desk, reading the diary, learning who would attend, who had expressed, with considerable feeling, her distrust of Mrs. Iris Fane, and who had said, clearly, directly, without hesitation, "I thought it was real. The note, I thought it was a genuine threat." Because Poirot now considered, as she had known it was real, she had written it. And yet the grey cells, even now, would not entirely settle. Because there was still the matter of Mrs. Fane's pause at the name Velt, and the matter of Mrs. Price in Cape Town, and the matter of Finch Hayes's fear, which was the fear of a man who knows something he cannot prove, not the fear of a man who merely suspects. He was still turning it over, carefully, methodically, like a man sorting through objects in a box, when he mounted the steps of number 43 and rang the bell. Mrs. Ashworth opened the door. Her face told him immediately that something had happened. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "thank God! Come in quickly." He came in. "What is it?" She led him, without speaking, to the morning room. He stopped in the doorway. The crystal vase was still there, as on the low table beside the fireplace. The first orchid, the Black Dracula Vampira, still stood in it, dark and perfect. Beside it, placed with a deliberateness that could not be accidental, was a second vase. And in the second vase, another black orchid, identical to the first, same species, same extraordinary depth of colour, same absolute composed perfection. And beneath it, a small white card, the same neat, unhurried handwriting. Poirot crossed the room in 4 steps and leaned forward to read it without touching it. One was a warning. This one is a promise. He straightened up. "When did this arrive?" he said. 20 minutes ago." Mrs. Ashworth's voice was admirably steady given the circumstances. The same as before, a boy at the door, young, perhaps 15. He said he had been paid to deliver it, and he could not describe the person who had paid him, only that it was a woman, and that she had given him a shilling and told him to bring it immediately. "A woman," said Poirot. "Yes." He looked at the 2 orchids side by side. 2 perfect black flowers, 2 crystal vases, 2 notes, one a warning and one a promise, and between them Lady Evelyn Marsh, lying upstairs barely conscious. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, "I want everyone back in this house, all 4 of them, tonight. Can you arrange it?" Yes, I believe so." "Good. Tell them that Lady Evelyn has asked for them, that she is well enough to receive visitors this evening and wishes to see her friends." He paused. "It will not be entirely true, but it will serve." Mrs. E. Ashworth looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who understands exactly what is being asked of her and disapproves of it slightly. "And will she be well enough to receive them?" "By this evening, possibly. Dr. Calthrop said she was improving." He turned back to the orchids. "In any case, it does not matter greatly whether Lady Evelyn is present or not. It is the other 4 whose presence I require." "You know who did it," said Mrs. Ashworth. It was not quite a question. Poirot was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said carefully, "considerably more than I knew this morning, but there is a difference, a very important difference, between knowing and being certain. And there is a further difference between being certain and being able to prove." He paused. "I came very close this afternoon to being certain about the wrong person. I do not intend to make that mistake again." Mrs. Ashworth looked at him. "You suspected Miss Rowe," she said quietly. Poirot turned to look at her. "What makes you say so?" "Because I suspected her too," said Mrs. Ashworth. After I told you about the writing desk, I assumed, she stopped. Was I wrong?" "You were not wrong to notice what you noticed," said Poirot carefully. "The visit to the desk was significant, and there are other things that point toward Miss Rowe that I cannot yet dismiss." He paused. "But I have learned today that this orchid, the one that was delivered here, was purchased by Miss Rowe, which is either—" He stopped. "Either she is guilty," said Mrs. Ashworth, "or," said Poirot quietly, "someone very much wishes me to believe she is." He looked at the two black orchids standing side by side in their crystal vases, beautiful, composed, entirely patient. One was a warning. This one is a promise. A promise to whom? About what? And why now? Why send a second orchid today, when the first had already served its purpose and the police were already in the house? Unless the second orchid was not directed at Lady Evelyn at all. Unless it was directed at Poirot. He stood for a long moment, very still, his eyes on the two dark flowers. Then he put on his hat, asked Mrs. Ashworth to make the telephone calls, and went to find Inspector Welch. There was, he felt, no time to lose. Jealousy wears silk gloves. Inspector Welch was not by nature a man who liked surprises. He had spent 22 years in the Metropolitan Police, developing a working relationship with the world that was based, fundamentally, on the premise that things could be managed if approached correctly, with procedure, with patience, and with a healthy suspicion of anyone who moved too quickly or thought too cleverly. He was good at his job. He knew he was good at his job. And he was sufficiently self-aware to know that Hercule Poirot, sitting across from him now in the small room off the hallway of number 43 Eaton Square, was considerably better at certain aspects of it than he was. This knowledge did not make him happy, but it made him at least cooperative, and he listened without interrupting, as Poirot laid out what he had learned that afternoon: the laboratory report, the visit to Veldt, the purchase of the orchid by someone identifying themselves as C. Rowe, the arrival of the second orchid and its note. When Poirot finished, Welch was quiet for a moment. "You think Rowe's being framed?" he said. "I think it is possible," said Poirot carefully. "I do not yet say it is certain. Miss Rowe purchased the orchid. That is a fact. Whether she purchased it as a gift, as she told Veldt, or whether she purchased it with the intention of using it as a vehicle for a death threat and a poison, that I cannot yet determine." "But you said she told Veldt it was a gift." "I did. And she told me this afternoon that she was enormously fond of Lady Evelyn. And yet she was also, 3 days before the dinner, reading Lady Evelyn's private diary without permission." He paused. "People are rarely entirely one thing, mon ami. That is what makes them interesting, and what makes them difficult." Welch drummed his fingers once on the table. "The second orchid, same delivery method as the first. Boy at the door, paid in cash, couldn't describe the sender clearly, except to say it was a woman." He looked at Poirot. "That fits Rowe. It also fits Fane." "It fits 3 of our 4 suspects," said Poirot. "Colonel Bramwell is the only one it does not fit, and he is the only one I am reasonably confident did not send it. Why? Because he is a man of direct action and direct speech. If Colonel Bramwell wished to make a threat, he would not do it with flowers." A pause. "He would also not do it at all, because he has nothing to gain from threatening Lady Evelyn, and considerable personal distress at the fact that she has been harmed." Welch considered this. "All right, so we have Rowe, Fane, and Finch Hayes." "Yes, and this evening you want them all here? All 4? Yes." Welch looked at him steadily. "You're planning a drawing-room reveal, Poirot?" I'm planning," said Poirot mildly, "to have a conversation. What emerges from that conversation, we shall see." By 7 o'clock that evening, number 43 Eaton Square had assumed a peculiar quality, the quality of a stage set in the interval before a performance begins. The drawing room on the first floor had been prepared. Chairs arranged, lamps lit, a small fire laid in the grate against the October chill. Mrs. Ashworth had produced, and with remarkable efficiency given the circumstances, a tray of drinks on the sideboard. The domestic formalities of the house continued, as they always do, regardless of what the house contains. The guests arrived within 20 minutes of each other. Colonel Bramwell came first, punctual as Poirot had expected. He took in the arrangement of the room with one swift glance, accepted a whisky from Mrs. Ashworth, and positioned himself near the fireplace with his back to the wall and his face to the door. Old habit, Miss Cecily Rowe arrived next, in the same navy dress she had worn that morning, her silver orchid brooch still at her collar. She looked, Poirot thought, tired, the specific tiredness of someone who has spent the day in a state of controlled anxiety. She refused a drink, sat down near the window, and looked at her hands. A Gerald Finch Hayes came third, with the punctuality of a man who had spent the intervening hours in considerable internal agitation, and was relieved now to have something concrete to do. He had brought, as promised, an envelope, which he handed to Poirot in the hallway before entering the drawing room. "The letters from Cape Town," he said quietly. Poirot thanked him and placed them in his breast pocket without opening them. Mrs. Iris Fane arrived last. She was, if anything, more composed than she had been that morning, which Poirot found interesting, because most people, confronted with a second threat and a police investigation, become less composed as the day progresses, not more. She wore a different dress, deep green this time, equally well cut, and her pearls, and she entered the room with the unhurried ease of a woman attending a social engagement she has looked forward to. She looked at Poirot as she entered. He looked at her. Something passed between them. Not communication exactly, but recognition. The recognition of two people who understand that the evening ahead will be consequential. She took a chair near the center of the room and accepted a glass of sherry. Inspector Welch stationed himself near the door. Poirot stood before the fireplace. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "I know it has been a long and difficult day, and I am grateful for your patience. Before we begin, Lady Evelyn is continuing to improve. She regained full consciousness at 6 o'clock this evening. She is not well enough to join us, but she is no longer in immediate danger." There was a general exhalation in the room. Genuine from most of them. From one, Poirot watched carefully. The expression of relief was a fraction slower than the others. Just a fraction. But he noted it. "I have asked you here," he continued, "because I believe that together in this room, we have all the pieces of what has occurred. I do not yet have them assembled correctly. I'm hoping that this evening will help me to do so." He paused. "I will be direct with you, because the situation requires directness. Lady Evelyn was poisoned by means of a compound derived from an orchid of the Dracula genus, the same genus as the Black Orchid that was delivered to this house last evening. The compound was placed in the water glass on her bedside table. This was not done by an intruder. It was done by someone who was in this house last night." The silence in the room was absolute. "Furthermore," said Poirot, "a second orchid arrived this afternoon, with a second note." He looked around the room. "One of you sent both of them." It was Miss Rowe who spoke first. "I bought the orchid," she said. Every head in the room turned toward her. Her voice was steady, the steadiness of someone who has spent the day deciding to say something and has now decided to say it. I purchased it 3 weeks ago from a botanical importer in Kensington. I bought it as a gift for Lady Evelyn. She had wanted a Dracula vampira for years. She had mentioned it to me several times. I thought... She stopped. I wanted to give her something significant, something that would matter to her. And the note? Said Poirot quietly. I did not write the note. She said it directly, looking at him. I purchased the orchid, and I intended to give it to Lady Evelyn at the dinner, to present it as a gift. But when I arrived that evening, the orchid was already there. Already in the vase, already with the note beneath it. Her voice tightened slightly. Someone took it. Someone knew I had bought it, and they took it, and they used it. How would someone have known you had purchased it? Said Poirot. A pause. I kept the receipt in my desk at the university, and I mentioned it once to someone I trusted. She stopped. To whom, mademoiselle? Her eyes moved, the briefest, most involuntary of movements, toward Mrs. Iris Fane. Mrs. Fane did not move. She held her sherry glass with perfect steadiness and looked at Miss Rowe with an expression of mild, polite attention, as though this were all moderately interesting but not personally relevant. Mrs. Fane, said Poirot, turning to her, you knew that Miss Rowe had purchased the orchid. I knew no such thing, said Mrs. Fane composedly. Cecily told you. Finch Hayes spoke abruptly from across the room. Everyone looked at him. He was looking at Mrs. Fane with an expression that was no longer merely worried, but something harder and colder than worry. I was present, at Evelyn's house, in July. You were both here, and Cecily mentioned she was planning a gift for Evelyn's birthday in October. She said she had found something extraordinary. She described it. She said it was an orchid, a very rare one. People describe gifts vaguely, said Mrs. Fane. I don't recall the specifics. You have, said Finch Hayes. An exceptionally precise memory, Mrs. Fane. I have observed it repeatedly. You recall the specifics of every conversation you consider useful. The temperature in the room had changed. It was subtle, but Poirot felt it. A shift from tension to something more exposed, more dangerous. Let us, said Poirot, before Mrs. Fane could respond, talk about the water glass. He had been building toward this quietly since the evening began. The water glass was the center of everything. Not the orchid. The orchid was a misdirection, or rather it was two things at once, a genuine gift, corrupted and turned into a weapon by someone who understood precisely what they were doing. But the water glass was the act itself, the deliberate, premeditated act of placing a poison in a glass of water beside a sleeping woman's bed. Mrs. Fane, said Poirot, you went upstairs last evening during dinner. You said the downstairs bathroom was occupied. That is correct. The bathroom on the first floor. It is at the end of the corridor, past Lady Evelyn's bedroom. I wouldn't know the layout of the upstairs in detail. And yet, said Poirot pleasantly, you have a key to the garden door. You have been coming to this house, by Mrs. Ashworth's account, twice a week for the better part of 8 months. In that time, I think it is reasonable to suppose that you have become familiar with the upstairs corridor. A small pause. I may have been upstairs on previous occasions, said Mrs. Fane. I don't see the relevance. The relevance, said Poirot, is this. The compound that was found in Lady Evelyn's water glass requires, Doctor, Calthrop has confirmed this, considerable preparation. It cannot be done quickly. It must be prepared in advance, stored carefully, brought to the house in a small quantity, a vial, perhaps something easily concealed, and then administered at the right moment. He looked at her steadily. The right moment presented itself last evening when you went upstairs. 5 minutes, Mrs. Ashworth said. 5 minutes is sufficient. This is speculation, said Mrs. Fane. Her voice was entirely level. You have no evidence that I brought any such compound into this house. Not yet, said Poirot, but I have something else. He reached into his breast pocket and produced the envelope Finch Hayes had given him. He did not open it. He simply held it. I have information about Mrs. Eleanor Price of Cape Town, and about the Kestrel Trust, and about the manner in which a considerable sum of money moved, imprecisely, irregularly, following Mrs. Price's death. The silence this time was of a different quality. Mrs. Fane looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Finch Hayes. Then she looked at Poirot. And for the first time since he had entered this house that morning, something in her extraordinary composure showed the very first hairline fracture. Those are private matters, she said, entirely unrelated to anything that has occurred here. They establish, said Poirot quietly, a pattern. And in the investigation of crime, a pattern is not nothing. A pattern is, in fact, a great deal. It was Colonel Bramwell who said what several people in the room were thinking. What was she after, he said. He was looking at Mrs. Fane with the flat, assessing look of a man who has suspected something for months, and is now watching it confirmed. Evelyn's money? Her estate? The orchid collection alone, said Finch Hayes tightly, is worth considerably more than most people in this street would imagine. There is also, said Mrs. Ashworth's voice from the doorway. She had been standing there, unnoticed for several minutes, the matter of the will. Everyone looked at her. She came into the room, folding her hands in her customary manner, and looked at Poirot. I should have mentioned this earlier. I apologize. Lady Evelyn changed her will in August. I was not meant to know, but I manage the household correspondence, and some things... She stopped. She made a new provision, a substantial bequest, to a charitable foundation. She looked at Mrs. Fane, one that Mrs. Fane had introduced her to. The room was very quiet. Poirot looked at Mrs. Iris Fane. She was looking at the window. Her sherry glass was still in her hand, entirely steady. Her face was composed, still composed. But it was the composition of someone who is working very hard now, for the first time all evening, to maintain it. Mrs. Fane, said Poirot gently, I think you have something to tell us. She looked at him. And then, slowly, precisely, with the deliberateness of someone choosing their words with the care of a person who knows that the words they choose now will matter enormously, she said, I want to speak to a solicitor. It was, Poirot reflected afterward, both a confirmation and a complication. A confirmation because an innocent person rarely responds to questions about charitable bequests by requesting legal counsel. A complication because it was not a confession. And in the absence of a confession, the evidence, while suggestive, while patent, while pointing with considerable insistence in one direction, was not yet what a court would require. The vial, if there was a vial, had not been found. The Second Orchid sender had not been conclusively identified. The compound in the water glass could be traced to the Dracula genus, but not to a specific specimen, not yet. Poirot sat in the morning room after Inspector Welch had escorted Mrs. Fane from the drawing room, not under arrest, but under the strong suggestion that she remain available. And the others had dispersed in the particular stunned and exhausted manner of people who have been through something they had not expected. He sat, and he looked at the two black orchids. One a gift turned into a weapon, one a warning or a threat, or, as he now believed, a misdirection. sent this afternoon not to intimidate Lady Evelyn further, but to ensure that the investigation's attention remained fixed on the orchid, on the drama of the flowers, and not on the quieter, more methodical thing that had actually occurred. The orchids were beautiful. That was the truth of it. They were genuinely, extraordinarily beautiful, and they had been used, both of them, precisely because of that beauty. Because beauty disarms, because elegance reassures, because a woman who receives a magnificent flower thinks first of admiration, and only later, too late perhaps, of danger. Jealousy, he thought, it wears silk gloves. He had been thinking of jealousy throughout this case in terms of Miss Rose's feeling toward Mrs. Fane, the jealousy of a young woman who admires an older one and finds that admiration threatened. But that was not the right jealousy. That was a minor theme. The real jealousy was Mrs. Fane's. Not jealousy of a person, but jealousy of a life, of wealth, of elegance, of the particular ease that Lady Evelyn Marsh possessed, and that Mrs. Iris Fane had spent years constructing a facsimile of, without Vince ever quite achieving the original. The silk gloves were real. The pearls were real. The composure was very nearly real. But beneath it, the grey cells were certain of this now, quite certain, was something that had curdled long ago into something uglier and more patient than mere envy. He looked at the orchids. One final thing was needed. One piece, the piece that would take this from pattern and suggestion into the realm of certainty. And Poirot believed, the grey cells believed, that he knew where to find it. He needed to speak to Lady Evelyn Marsh. The drawing-room confession. Lady Evelyn Marsh received him at 8:30. She was sitting up in bed, propped against 3 pillows, a pale blue shawl around her shoulders, her silver hair brushed and arranged with the care of a woman who will not, under any circumstances, receive visitors in disorder. The colour had not yet fully returned to her face, and her eyes, though clear now, had about them the particular quality of someone who has looked, briefly and unwillingly, at something very dark, and has come back from it but not entirely forgotten what they saw. Dr. Calthrop stood near the door. He had agreed to 5 minutes, he said, and he meant 5 minutes. Poirot sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at Lady Evelyn Marsh. And she looked at him, and they regarded each other for a moment with the mutual attention of two people who understand, without preamble, that the conversation they are about to have is important. "You are Poirot," she said. Her voice was thin but entirely precise. "Dorothea told me she had called you." "Yes, madame. She was right to do so." A pause. "I understand you have had a productive day." "A long one," said Poirot. "Whether productive, we shall see." He paused. "Madame, I will not tire you with the details of the investigation. You will have time enough, when you are well, to learn everything. But there is one thing I need from you tonight. One thing that only you can tell me." She looked at him steadily. "Ask it." "The will," he said. "The provision you made in August. The charitable foundation." Something moved in Lady Evelyn's face. Not surprise. She was beyond surprise tonight, he thought, but something more complex. Something that had several layers to it, and that she examined, briefly, before she spoke. "The Meridian Trust," she said. "Iris Fane introduced you to it." "Yes," a pause. "She spoke of it with great feeling. She said it supported conservation work. Botanical conservation specifically. Rare species in danger of extinction." The faintest, most controlled of expressions crossed her face. "I found that, naturally, very compelling. How much, madame? The bequest?" Lady Evelyn looked at the window for a moment. £200,000, she said. to be released upon my death. The figure settled in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Poirot was quiet for a moment. And the Meridian Trust, have you independently verified its existence, its activities? A very long pause. No, said Lady Evelyn. Said it quietly, and with the particular difficulty of a highly intelligent woman acknowledging that she has been, in a specific and significant way, foolish. I did not, she said again. Iris spoke of it with such conviction, such personal investment. I trusted her. I have trusted her. She stopped. I have trusted her considerably. You care for her, said Poirot gently. Not a question. Lady Evelyn looked at him with those clear, tired eyes. I am 63 years old, Monsieur Poirot, she said. My husband has been dead for 8 years. I have a great many acquaintances, and very few people whom I would describe as genuine friends. A pause. Iris she seemed to be. She was very present, very attentive, She stopped. I am not a sentimental woman, but loneliness is a very quiet thing. It sits with you, and you do not always notice it until something comes along that displaces it. She folded her thin hands on the coverlet. And then when that thing proves to have been not what it appeared, the loneliness is considerably worse than before, because now you know its shape more precisely. Poirot said nothing for a moment. He thought, not for the first time, that the cruelty of what Mrs. Fane had done was not primarily the poison, though the poison was serious enough. It was this: the deliberate construction of trust, the careful cultivation of affection, of the patient installation of herself into the life of a woman who was lonely and generous, and entirely too willing to believe in the sincerity of those who attended her. The poison was merely the mechanism. The real crime had begun 8 months ago, in a gallery at an opening when a woman named Iris Fane had looked at Lady Evelyn Marsh and seen not a person but a prize. Madam, he said quietly, I must ask you one further thing. The key to the garden door, the one you gave to Mrs. Fane. Is there another copy? Lady Evelyn frowned slightly. There is the original, which I gave to Iris, and there is a spare, which hangs in the kitchen. Why? Because I believe, said Poirot carefully, that Mrs. Fane had access to this house on a day when neither you nor Mrs. Ashworth were present. Approximately 10 days ago, Mrs. Ashworth has told me you were both out for the afternoon. You at an engagement in Mayfair, she visiting her sister in Hammersmith. Lady Evelyn was very still. The house was empty. For approximately 4 hours, yes, he paused. Mrs. Fane knew your habits. She knew your schedule. She had, I believe, been planning this for some time, since perhaps the moment she learned that Miss Rowe had purchased a rare black orchid as a gift for you. He paused. She obtained the orchid. I do not yet know precisely how, but I have my suspicions. And she brought with it the compound she had already prepared. She placed the compound here, in this room, in your water glass, on that afternoon, and then she waited for the dinner. Lady Evelyn looked at the water glass on her bedside table. It had been replaced with a fresh one. The original was with the police analyst. But she looked at the spot where it had stood as though she could see it still. She was here, she said slowly. That afternoon, she did come actually. She said she had left a scarf. I wasn't home, but Mrs. Ashworth let her in. Yes, or no. Mrs. Ashworth was already gone, but Iris had the key. She stopped. She let herself in through the garden door. And she was here alone for how long? I don't know. Mrs. Ashworth came back first, I think. She might know. I will ask her. He paused. But madame, this is important. Did anything seem disturbed when you came home? Anything out of place? Lady Evelyn thought carefully. No, nothing, She paused. "Except the water glass. I remember thinking it was not where I usually kept it. I assumed Mrs. E. Ashworth had moved it when she cleaned. I thought nothing of it." "No," said Poirot softly. "Of course not." Dr. Calthrop cleared his throat from the doorway. Poirot held up one finger without turning around. The doctor subsided. "Madame," said Poirot, "I have one final question, and you must answer it honestly, even if the answer is difficult." He paused. "Is there anyone at all, who might have told Mrs. Fane that Miss Rowe had purchased the orchid, other than Miss Rowe herself?" Lady Evelyn considered this carefully, with the methodical attention of a woman who does not answer important questions carelessly. "Iris and Cecily were both here in July," she said slowly, "at tea. Cecily mentioned her plan. She was excited about it. She couldn't quite contain it. She said she had found something extraordinary for my birthday. As she described it." A pause. "I knew, from her description, that it was a black orchid. I didn't say so. I didn't want to spoil her pleasure in the surprise." She stopped. "Iris was present. She would have known too." "You said nothing to Mrs. Fane afterward? Did not mention that you had understood what the gift was?" "No. I said nothing to anyone." She looked at him. "Do you think Iris used that knowledge to take the orchid?" "I think," said Poirot, "that when Mrs. Fane heard Miss Rowe describe the gift, a rare black orchid, she recognized immediately that it gave her something invaluable. Not merely an orchid, but a perfect way to administer a threat and a poison, and to ensure that if anything went wrong, the evidence pointed directly at Miss Rowe instead of at herself." He paused. "The purchase was in Miss Rowe's name. If the expertise was Miss Rowe's, everyone knew she studied orchids, everyone knew she could identify them, handle them, knew their properties. If the poison were traced to the orchid genus, as it was, who would be the natural suspect?" "Cecily," said Lady Evelyn, very quietly. "Yes." Poirot paused. "Mrs. Fane is a very patient woman, and a very thorough one, but she made one error." "What error?" "The second orchid," said Poirot. "She sent it this afternoon, I believe to reinforce the impression that Miss Rowe was responsible, to keep attention fixed on the flowers and not on the quieter matter of the water glass and the access to this room. But the second orchid was unnecessary. It was the action of someone who is accustomed to controlling a situation and felt this morning that control beginning to slip." He paused. "Issue and unnecessary actions taken from anxiety are where careful people make their mistakes." Lady Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "The boy who delivered it," she said, "could he identify her?" "Inspector Welch is working on that now," said Poirot. "There is also the matter of where she obtained the second orchid. A second Dracula vampira is not easily found. If she obtained it from Veltz, there will be a record. If she obtained it elsewhere, there will be another record. These things are traceable." He paused. "And there are the letters from Cape Town. Monsieur Finch Hayes has been most helpful in that regard." Dr. Calthrop stepped forward. "Monsieur Poirot," he said firmly this time, "that really must be all for tonight." Poirot rose. He straightened his coat, picked up his hat, and looked at Lady Evelyn Marsh. She looked back at him. The tiredness was still there, and the shadow of what she had been through, and something else now. Something more complicated and more painful than mere physical recovery. The specific pain of a person reassembling their understanding of someone they had trusted. "Monsieur Poirot," she said. "Madam?" "Gerald," she said. "Gerald Finch Hayes. He tried to warn me. In June, I sent him away." She paused. "I was unkind to him." "He does not hold it against you," said Poirot. "No," she said, "he wouldn't. A pause. He never has. Poirot nodded once, gently, and left the room. He found Inspector Welch at 11 o'clock that evening, in the small room off the hallway where he had set up his temporary operations. The inspector looked up as Poirot entered, and the expression on his face told Poirot, before a word was spoken, that something had developed. "The boy," said Welch. "We found him. 15 years old, lives in Pimlico. He identified the woman who paid him." He paused. He was quite certain. He said she was well dressed, dark hair, spoke with a slight accent he couldn't place. Gave him a shilling and told him to be quick. "Mrs. Vane. He identified her from a photograph, yes." Welch set down his pen, and Veltz confirmed it. "She came to the shop 6 days ago, under a different name, but the description is unambiguous, and Velt himself remembers her. She purchased a second specimen. He had acquired one more, from the same Ecuadorian grower, and she paid considerably above the asking price." "Cash," said Poirot. "Cash," confirmed Welch. "And there's something else. When we searched her hotel room, she's been staying at a small hotel in Knightsbridge, which is interesting in itself given that she's been telling Lady Evelyn she has a flat in Chelsea." He looked at Poirot. "We found a small glass vial in the lining of a travel case. The laboratory will need to confirm, but it appears to contain a residue of the same compound found in Lady Evelyn's water glass." Poirot sat down. He was quiet for a moment. It was, he supposed, the moment at which a case resolves itself, when the pieces that have been moving and shifting and refusing to align finally find their positions, and the picture becomes clear. He had experienced this moment many times. It never felt quite as satisfying as it ought to. There was always, underneath the clarity, a residue of something else, a something that was not quite sorrow, but was adjacent to it. "The Meridian Trust," he said. "Have you been able to trace it? Registered in the Channel Islands 2 years ago, nominally charitable. In practice," Welch shook his head. "Our financial colleagues are still working through it, but the initial assessment is that it is a shell. The funds would have been redirected, as they were in Cape Town." £200,000, said Poirot. "Yes." "For which she was willing to poison a woman who had shown her nothing but kindness and generosity." He said it quietly, without anger. The anger had burned down, over the course of the day, into something cooler and more settled. That is the arithmetic of obsession, mon ami. When the object is large enough, and the obsession sufficient, the human cost becomes abstract. One does not think of the person. One thinks only of the thing one wants. Welch looked at him. "Will she confess, do you think?" Poirot considered. "She will attempt first to construct an alternative account. She is intelligent and controlled, and she will not give up easily. But the evidence, the boy's identification, the vial, the record at Velt's shop, the letters from Cape Town, it is a great deal. And she knows it." He paused. "At some point, a person of Mrs. Vane's particular temperament makes a calculation. The calculation is whether it is more advantageous to continue denying or to offer some degree of cooperation in exchange for some degree of consideration. When she has made that calculation, and I think she will make it quite soon, perhaps by tomorrow morning, she will tell Inspector Welch what he needs to know. And Miss Rowe, said Poirot, bought a flower for a woman she admired. She looked in a diary she should not have looked in, which was wrong, and she knows it was wrong, and I think the experience of this week will ensure she does not do it again." He paused. "But she is not a criminal. She is a young woman who was used, her knowledge, her purchase, her feelings, as the material for someone else's plan. That is not guilt. That is misfortune." Welch nodded slowly. "Finch Hayes, a good man who waited too long to act on what he knew, and who has already punished himself for it more severely than any court would." Poirot rose and reached for his hat. "He will be all right, I think, particularly now." "And Bramwell?" Poirot almost smiled. Colonel Bramwell noticed a motor car. He trusted his instinct and said what he thought and was ignored, and continued to say what he thought regardless. "He will be entirely all right." He put on his hat. "He always will be. It is his particular gift." He was at the door of number 43. It was nearly midnight now, and the square outside was quiet and still, the lamp-posts casting their pale circles on the damp pavement, when Mrs. Ashworth appeared behind him. "Monsieur Poirot." He turned. She stood in the hallway, her hands folded, her grey dress as precise as it had been at 9 o'clock that morning. Only her eyes showed the accumulated weight of the day. "I wanted to thank you," she said simply. "It is I who should thank you," said Poirot. "The detail about the writing desk, the will, the afternoon when the house was empty, and without those things," he paused. "You see a great deal, madame. You always have. You simply needed someone to listen." She looked at him for a moment. "Will Lady Evelyn be all right? Not physically, I mean the other way." Poirot understood what she meant. The other way. The recovery that takes longer, and has no laboratory test to confirm it, and cannot be measured by a doctor with a watch counting slow breaths. "She is a strong woman," he said. "She will be hurt. She is already hurt. But strength that has been tested is, in the end, stronger for it." He paused. "And she has around her people who care for her genuinely. Monsieur Finch Hayes, Colonel Bramwell, Miss Rowe, you yourself." He looked at her steadily. "That is not nothing, madame. That is in fact a considerable amount." Mrs. Ashworth nodded once. He put on his hat, obeyed her good night, and descended the steps of number 43 Eaton Square into the quiet October night. He walked for a while, rather than hailing a cab immediately. The streets of Belgravia at midnight had a particular quality. The cream stucco of the great houses pale in the lamplight, the plane trees bare and still, the occasional motor car passing with a sound that dissolved quickly into the silence. It was a neighborhood that had learned, over generations, to wear its composure beautifully, to present to the world a face of perfect arrangement and elegant sufficiency. And beneath that face, as beneath all beautiful faces, the full complicated human reality. Loneliness and longing and the desire to be seen. Jealousy wearing its silk gloves. Obsession arranging itself in a crystal vase. And also, this too, is this always the other things. A man who had loved a woman quietly for 30 years and had never stopped. A young woman who had bought a flower because she wanted to give someone she admired something that would matter. An old soldier who noticed motor cars and said what he thought and could not be moved from it. A housekeeper who saw everything and waited patiently for someone to ask. Poirot stopped at the corner of the square and looked back at number 43. The house stood as it always had, composed cream-stuccoed, the glossy black door shut, the bay trees in their iron planters standing their patient sentinel. From the first-floor window, a light still burned. Lady Evelyn, he supposed, still awake. Thinking perhaps about the shape of things, about what had been and what had nearly been, and what, with luck and time, and in the company of people who were genuinely what they appeared to be, might still come. He turned up his collar against the October chill. 2 black orchids in a morning room, one a gift, one a weapon, both beautiful. And in the morning, when all of this was done, and the police had finished and the house had returned to itself, someone, Mrs. Ashworth, probably, with her customary quiet efficiency, would remove them both from their crystal vases and take them somewhere to be properly looked after. Because the flowers themselves were innocent. They were only flowers. It was what people did with beautiful things that told you everything you needed to know about them. Poirot walked on into the London night, his footsteps precise and unhurried on the damp pavement, the little grey cells all ready, despite everything, and despite the hour and the cold and the long day behind him, turning with quiet interest toward whatever might come next.